How many times a day do you have the experience where that constant churning in your mind just kind of stops and slows down, and you're able to just kind of be present, maybe experience a sense of contentment or gratitude, be in touch with the presence of God or the divine presence or something bigger than yourself? And maybe you're thinking, how many times a day? Yeah, most days just kind of go by in this constant churn of thought and anxiety. So maybe think about it in terms of how many times in the last week, how many times in the last month, or maybe that's just something that you've never experienced before. So what I want to talk about today is this what I would call the synergy or combo between what I call centering for wisdom and the HeartMath coherence experience. So the basic idea with centering for wisdom is actually really simple. It's this idea that everyone, you, me, everybody on this planet has this inner core of goodness and wisdom that we were born with, that God has sort of implanted in us as human beings. And part of that inner core of goodness and wisdom is our direction, our sense of purpose in life. It's our use of our skills and talents to kind of give back to others and to the common good. And it can guide not only, kind of big picture decisions, big discernment about career or relationships, but also just the day-to-day decisions that we all have to make. Now, the idea with centering for wisdom is that when we're in that constant churn in our mind, we can't access that inner core of goodness. It's literally kind of offline. We don't have access to our hearts, and we don't have access to those higher powers in our prefrontal cortex of our brain where we make and execute decisions. It literally kind of goes offline. So the whole idea of centering for wisdom is developing a daily contemplative practice. I teach centering prayer and meditation to be able to kind of allow that clutter to settle a little bit. Sometimes I use the image of throwing a pebble into a river and kind of letting it settle onto the bottom in like the sandy bottom of a riverbed, and all that churning can be going by up top. But if you're in that heart and mind aligned space, centered, then all that churning is not disrupting your ability to be present and to be in touch with that wisdom. Another metaphor that I use is it's like putting in the clutch on a car. So I don't know how many of you have ever driven an automatic or a manual car at this point, but it's like putting in the clutch and being able to disengage from all those thoughts that are going by. So the idea then is when you can be in that space, you are able to access the full wisdom of your heart, the wisdom of God and the Spirit working through you, and you're also aligned so that your heart and the higher powers of your brain are working together. Now, if you're constantly caught up in this churning, this mental chatter that I'm talking about, or the chronic stress, or maybe even burnout, it gets even harder to switch back into that more centered space. And I want to share with you a little handout that we got from the HeartMath training that I'm going through that I find really helpful here for. So it talks about how over time, let me put this up here for you. If I were really technically savvy, I would, share my screen, but we're not there yet. I'm sure I could do it. So you can kind of see how your performance, actually stress and pressure can be kind of a good thing at the beginning, right? They can increase our performance as we embrace a challenge. And then we can sustain that for a certain amount of time, some longer, some less. It just kind of depends. We all have different capacities for handling stress and how well we're taking care of ourselves. And then at some point, that performance level starts to go down and suffer. And we start to move into, I like how they put this, the hyperreactive stage, where we're just constantly churning and the brain is just taking over. And then if we keep pushing, we're eventually going to hit emotional and physical exhaustion and hit a total breakdown. And you can see that performance goes, all the way down to zero if you're totally knocked out by some kind of like physical or mental illness. And that's just on the performance level. Doesn't even sort of get into what happens to our spiritual lives when we're stuck in that kind of state. So centering for wisdom, and specifically doing a daily deep contemplative practice, is one part of kind of breaking that cycle up. And what happens is, most of that churning that we have going in our brain is caused by our sort of getting caught up in our own like ego and desires and that persona. And we all need that ego, that persona that we put out into the world in order to be successful. And that's fine. But when we get caught up in it, then we start to get really attached to like needing things to turn out a certain way, and needing to like force the situation or force things to happen. And one of the cool things about the daily practice of centering, prayer, and meditation is by working with your sacred word, you start to learn how to disengage from that constant churning of thoughts. And that allows you to kind of come deeper into like that centered space and be present for longer periods of time while you're doing a more formal sitting practice. And what starts to happen over time is that you start to access deeper and deeper layers of healing, because you start to notice the little tricks of the ego and the constant churning of the mind and how they're not serving you. They're actually keeping you just caught up in that anxious pattern. So you get those moments that I asked you about at the beginning, those moments of kind of allowing the churning of the mind to kind of step back from that, to have a sense of presence, to feel connected to a sense of like clarity about your purpose and what you want to be focused on, because we can get so caught up in just the day-to-day and survival mode. So there's a really deep healing that happens there. On a theology or theological or spiritual level, that stillness and that silence of settling in like that allows the divine presence, we could call it grace in more biblical technical language, to work deep into our hearts and our minds, to kind of dismantle all the ways that we stay stuck and attached to our ego and our identity. So we're able to let that go. So there's a really deep healing. Now, one of the things that I've noticed in coaching and working with people in that practice is usually it takes, I would say, several weeks, maybe even a month or even two. There's no formula, but it takes a while to kind of have that daily experience. And most people kind of sit there thinking, why am I doing this? Nothing's really changing. We don't feel the change immediately. We might have moments where you're sitting there and feel really peaceful or feel the presence of God. But it's hard to kind of feel like, oh, there's some deep, lasting change happening here right away. Now, what happens later when people stick with the practice is they start to have experiences of being less reactive, or maybe often others, like a spouse or a coworker or a child, will notice the change and kind of point it out to you. And then once people have that experience, it becomes easier to stick with the daily practice. So that's kind of my goal, is to help people move into that space, to kind of break that chronic stress and burnout cycle, but also to access that deeper wisdom and guidance so that you have that sense of purpose and clarity as you go throughout your days. But one of the challenges in that interim period that I find is that it's easy to get kind of like sidetracked or give up. And that's what led me to start working with the HeartMath Institute and their idea of finding coherence. And there's the sensor that you can use to kind of track your level of coherence, and I've shown that in some previous videos. I'm not going to show that today. That kind of helps you see over time, oh, I'm able to get into and sustain a coherent state where my heart and my mind are aligned and there's less resistance. I'm not going offline where my brain is getting hijacked. So it gives people that initial sense of like, oh, this is working, this is happening, there's real change happening. The other cool thing about these coherence techniques that I've been learning through the training, and I think we've learned 4 or 5 of them at this point, they're all things that can be done really quick. They can even be done in the middle of an active day. So, we try to sort of have the daily centering prayer and meditation twice a day, ideally, once kind of in the morning, once afternoon, evening, to kind of balance out the day. But even when you're doing that, you're still going to be going through your life and experiencing challenges. So these quick coherence techniques are really cool, and many of them can even be done with eyes open, while you're on your computer, while you're talking to someone else, while you're in a meeting, to just kind of come back and get that heart space realigned and move into that space of heartfulness and deeper presence. So that allows you to have these kind of quick access points to kind of reset as you go throughout your day. So again, you don't go into that kind of, that churn doesn't become like that hyper-reactive stage that's really hard to get out of. So it's like you're doing your daily maintenance. In fact, in centering prayer and meditation, we talk about how, Your first sit in the morning is your maintenance sit, and your second sit is sometimes what we call your therapeutic sit. It gets you even deeper in there. And then the coherence throughout the day and measuring your progress shows you how you're able to come back more quickly, reset, and plug those energy leaks so that you're not moving into that frantic stage that's going to push you towards burnout and exhaustion. And then when you're able to put that together, and we make it really simple because none of these techniques are hard, it's just about fitting them into your life and integrating them. And that's what I mostly help people do, is kind of the teaching it is easy. It's the practice and consistency that is a bit more of a challenge. So then when you can do that, I'll put this up again, right? You're able to kind of stay in this zone and maybe come down into deep rest every once in a while, but you can maintain this across time instead of tanking and going into that burnout range. So that's really what we're working on here when we talk about that alignment between centering for wisdom and a daily contemplative practice and the HeartMath coherence practices and techniques. So I mentioned this before, I'm kind of working on putting together a new webinar or masterclass about how all this fits together, as well as revising the coaching program to integrate some of the HeartMath sensor and techniques and things, but we'll keep all the good stuff that we have taught before about centering prayer and meditation and the centering for wisdom process, getting in touch with your root why and staying aligned with that all day, every day, so that you have that consistent energy and you're able to keep that clarity of purpose, as well as the divine presence and God's healing and grace kind of in the forefront as you go throughout your day. And that, that makes for a pretty darn good life with your own inner mental and spiritual health, with healthy relationships, with that sense of purpose to keep you on track in your professional life as well. So I'll continue to post updates here. Stay tuned, especially when I have that new masterclass and some of the new program put together. I will keep you posted. In the meantime, hope you are all doing well. Thanks, and have a great rest of your day.